Hello everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm here with Dr. Virgil Zeigler-Hill. He is professor of psychology and director of graduate training at Oakland University. He is a social personality psychologist with primary research interests in four interrelated areas: self-esteem, narcissism, cognitive representations of the self, and interpersonal relationships, and we're going to try to cover all of those topics today. So Dr. Zeigler-Hill, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you.
Okay, great. So let's start with self-esteem. But before we get specifically into self-esteem, let's talk a little bit about this concept of the self, because it seems to me, at least I've already had on the show several social psychologists and philosophers of mind with whom I talked about what really is the self about, and it seems that different people have different definitions for it and think about it in different ways, and there are even people that say that we don't really have a self, that's some sort of illusion. So what's your take on that?
So I would completely agree with the perspective that probably everyone who is at all interested in the self probably has a slightly different definition for what it is that they think they're studying. I completely and utterly agree with that. And that has certainly been one of the issues that has led to a great deal of confusion in the literature on topics connected to the self, is the fact that oftentimes people will be talking about things using the same term, but really be talking about quite different constructs. And so I completely agree with that. The aspects of the self that I'm most interested in are the aspects that have to do with how people think about themselves, how people organize knowledge and information about themselves, so pieces of the self-concept, and also self-evaluation. So things like self-esteem and narcissism are entwined with those kind of overall evaluations that people have about the kind of person that they think that they are. Now, as far as is there really a self, I've certainly had those sorts of debates with individuals as well. Of, is this all just some sort of illusion that people have? And I think it is possible that that's all it is we're just kind of reconstructing this self on a moment-to-moment basis, and it is just some sort of illusion of any sort of permanent self. So I don't dispute that. It is possible. At the same time, I think it's still a useful construct for thinking about how individuals are thinking about the sort of person that they are, because that does have implications for guiding their behavior. So even if we go beyond the idea that maybe it is something of an illusion, I still think it can be a very helpful construct in terms of understanding why people do some of the things that they do.
Mm-hmm. So even if it is an illusion, it is helpful for us to understand certain cognitive or psychological mechanisms, right?
I think it certainly can be, and I think it's. I think there definitely is something important in how the sort of information that people have about themselves. For example, if someone believes that they are an honest person, that is likely going to help them make sense of their past behavior, as well as help them formulate strategies for the future. And so I think some of those sorts of things can be really important, even if some of our current understanding about how the self actually operates is very poor, which I completely agree with. Yeah.
Okay. And this self-concept you were just telling us about, is it about the way people think about themselves? I mean, if they think that they are this or that kind of person, is that it?
Yeah. So the self-concept has a lot to do with the sort of information that people have about themselves. And there have been a couple of different approaches to kind of thinking about the self-concept. And one of the things, the reason I initially became interested in the self-concept was I was really introduced to an area of work when I was a graduate student. I was mentored by someone named Carolyn Showers, and she does a lot of work on how individuals organize information about themselves. And the reason that's important is if we think about all of the domains that we know something about, the thing that we know the most about is ourselves, because we live with ourselves every moment of every day. We know all the great things that we've done, all the horrible things that we've done. And what she and others have argued is that when you have that much information, the way in which you organize that information is really important for a number of reasons. One of them has to do with the idea of the accessibility of information. And so what she argued, along with some other folks, is that the way in which people organize information, kind of like books in a library, if information is organized in a certain way, it makes certain information more accessible. And a lot of her work had to do with thinking about this accessibility of both positive and negative information about the self, and the sort of situations that would activate that. So people who organized their self-concepts in a particular way, if they experience some sort of frustration or failure, it would trigger this kind of cascade or flood of other negative information about the self. Whereas for other folks, they were much more resilient. And so she showed that in a lot of her work, that it isn't just whether or not people think good things or bad things about themselves, but it's also how they organize that information that ends up being really important.
Mm-hmm. And this self-concept, do you know how we construct it or develop it? Is it that we learn things about our own selves, I mean, just over time as we are developing as people, or is it information that we get from other people about us?
So the answer is it seems to be a bit of both. So there have been different researchers argue slightly different things and take similar bits of information and interpret them in very different ways. I think a lot of it comes from how we believe other people are perceiving us. So, for example, if you are a young person in high school, for example, and if it seems like your teachers are treating you as if you are very smart and intelligent and capable, the idea is that over time, those sorts of things should probably be integrated into our own views of ourselves. We start thinking of ourselves as being intelligent and capable. And so I think a lot of this has to do with our perceptions of how others view us. Now, I don't think that's where everything comes from, because as you were mentioning, we also have our own experiences. So even if no one else is there, we recognize when we are doing things where we grasp something very quickly, or if it takes us a long time to understand something that other people seem to understand pretty quickly, that may also have implications for the way we think about ourselves, especially if there's a disconnect between how an individual believes that others view them and how they really think about themselves, which can certainly happen as well.
Mm-hmm. And do we know if the self-concept is in any way innate or not? I mean, you've already told us that we get information from ourselves and from other people, and I guess that would be a sort of developmental aspect of this self-concept. But can it have also an innate component to it?
We don't know. I think that would be the fairest thing to say. There's been speculation on both sides that it is extremely malleable and very susceptible to social influence, and I think there's some evidence for that. I think some of the I think a lot of the information, as well as how it's organized, may have a lot to do with socialization processes, but the work is not very good. For example, things when it comes to issues like heritability, we don't know. The work has not been all that great in terms of looking at how self-concept related variables kind of are transmitted across generations. I don't think we know enough to make any sort of definitive claim at the moment. There's been a lot of speculation about it, but I haven't seen great evidence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I asked you that because since you also study personality And I was just thinking about the big five, for example. I was imagining that perhaps because, as we know from behavior genetics, around 50% of our personality is heritable, that personality would influence the sort of self or self-image or self-concept that we construct about ourselves. I mean, just thinking about certain predispositions that people have, like, for example, I tend to suffer from depression, and I mean, it's very easy for me to have a negative self-concept of myself, right? Because it's very easy for me to look at the mistakes that I do, at the wrong things that I do, and things like that, and just focus on that. So, what do you think about that?
I think you're probably right. If there is a heritable, it's probably about the same as what we see for a lot of other things in social personality psychology. You know, the 50% idea shows up a lot, which in one could actually just be that, you know, there really is a fairly even distribution of kind of nature and nurture components, if you want to think about it in that way. Or it suggests that maybe we just don't have a great way of estimating some of those things, which is always one of my concerns when we start thinking about how much of this is really due to genetic predisposition, how much is socialization, how much is really the interaction of the two. And I think it's very difficult to disentangle those. I know some folks invest a tremendous amount of effort trying to disentangle those, but I think it's difficult to do so. And with the self-concept stuff, I don't think we know quite enough. My guess is it's probably similar to personality in terms of, you know, roughly about 50% would be my guess, but I just don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so what is self-esteem then?
So self-esteem has to do with the way in which individuals evaluate themselves. So when we think about the self-concept, it's the knowledge that people have about themselves. Self-esteem is then going to be, what do people actually think about themselves? So for example, if you think that you're someone who's intelligent, that you're attractive, that you're capable, hardworking, all these lovely sorts of things, there's a very good chance that you would then have relatively high self-esteem. If in contrast, if you think that you're someone who is lazy and dishonest and all these horrible sorts of things, it's likely you may have low self-esteem. And so self-concept and self-esteem are certainly connected to each other, but they're distinct in that the self-concept is the beliefs that individuals have, and self-esteem is the evaluation of the sort of person that you think you are.
And there are two different kinds of self-esteem, implicit and explicit, right?
Yeah, you know, the implicit and explicit stuff, it's been something that researchers have been interested in for, I guess, time flies. I guess it's been 25, 30 years now, which doesn't seem like it's been around that long, but it's been a while, I guess. And so explicit self-esteem has to do with, if you ask someone, you know, what do you think about yourself? Would you evaluate yourself as being someone with high self-esteem or low self-esteem? Explicit self-esteem is what the person can tell you. It's what they're consciously aware of. Implicit self-esteem is much more complicated, and there's been a lot of disagreement and confusion about what exactly implicit self-esteem even is. When the construct was first developed, what people thought, and what I thought it was that it was really a sort of non-conscious self-evaluation. So the idea is that people were trying to develop these techniques through things like reaction time sorts of measures that would somehow get below the surface and get at those real sorts of unconscious evaluations of the self. And for years, that's what we thought was being tapped into with measures of implicit self-esteem. More recently, and I guess even this perspective has been around for a while at this point, it became less clear whether what people were really tapping into were a different type of attitude about the self, or if some of those implicit measures really were just kind of indirect ways of getting at the same sorts of explicitly reported attitudes, but kind of going around any sort of filters that people may have had about their unwillingness to acknowledge certain things. So, for example, with self-report measures, a couple of things that people are always assuming is that if I were to give someone a self-report measure of self-esteem, I'm assuming that the individual, one, is going to have adequate insight into how they actually feel about themselves, and two, that they're going to be willing to be honest with me about reporting that. And if one or both of those things is not true, self-report measures don't function terribly well. And so with implicit measures, it isn't clear what exactly they're getting at. Are they getting at a completely and utterly kind of parallel attitude about the self, which is what we initially thought? Or is it the case that they're really another means, an indirect means of getting at that one single true attitude about the self, and any deviation from the self-report measure, the explicit measure, is it due to them being different attitudes, or just you're kind of getting around those filters that people would normally have where they're being maybe slightly dishonest in their reports? And the reality is we still don't know what implicit self-esteem is.
Mm-hmm. But do people measure implicit self-esteem in some way, and how do they do that?
Sure. So there are actually a large number of strategies at this point for trying to tap into implicit self-esteem. The most famous approach is something called the implicit association test, which is well known for measuring things like unconscious racial prejudice and so on. What the self-esteem version of the implicit association test does is it tries to capture how quickly people can associate their self, the idea of the self, with positive or negative stimuli. And the idea is that if individuals are really quite quick in making those connections between the self and positive things compared to the self and negative things, that would suggest that they have this positive implicit attitude about the self. And that's certainly the way people often interpret those sorts of results. The issue over time has been that we still don't absolutely know what those sorts of measures really are tapping into.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and one of the reasons I asked you that is because since you mentioned the implicit association test, recently, particularly with the replication crisis in psychology, it seems that things like the implicit association test and implicit bias, for example, have been a bit under fire, because it seems that the literature on those phenomena, or in this case on the phenomenon of implicit bias, is a little bit lacking, let's say. Right.
I think that would be fair. The replication crisis has caused a lot of us to rethink and be a little more skeptical about some of the things that we thought we already knew. And I think some of the work in the implicit attitude literature is, I think, kind of getting renewed interest, in part just to make sure about what exactly is going on. And I think a lot of the implicit self-esteem effects so in my work I was doing I did a bit with implicit self-esteem I think in the early mid 2000s, and I became disenchanted with that work because in replication studies within my own lab I would have difficulty finding the same effect in study after study, and it made me very nervous about continuing to do work in that area. So I ended up stopping a long time ago, because for myself I was never really sure why the effects would emerge in one study but not another one, and it just made me very uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in your work you study also the status signaling model of self-esteem. Could you tell us about it?
Sure. So with self-esteem, there has been a tremendous amount of work about self-esteem, and one of the really interesting things about self-esteem was that until the mid-90s, really people hadn't thought very carefully or clearly about why individuals have self-esteem and why individuals really care about their own self-esteem. And a guy named Mark Leary developed something called the sociometer model, which argues that individuals don't actually care that much about self-esteem for its own sake. Rather, they use self-esteem as being an indicator of something else. And what he was arguing at the time with the sociometer model is that individuals are using self-esteem as really an indicator of their relational value, how much they think other people value them. And so he argued that what self-esteem really does is it tracks something else. And so for him it was about relational value. Now over time, the way in which the sociometer model kind of characterizes relational value changes a bit, but in general it's about how much people like you. Other folks like Konstantin Sadikides in more recent years and some of his group have argued that self-esteem also tracks a person's status and dominance. And so they developed something called a hierometer model. What both of those approaches argue is that self-esteem is tracking something about how we think others perceive us. What the status signaling model was arguing when I developed it, the idea was that not only are we receiving this information from others, but I also thought that our self-esteem may also be influencing how other people are perceiving us. So not only are the perception, how we perceive others and the way in which they're viewing us, influencing our own beliefs about ourselves, but I also think that when individuals are, for example, if someone has a great deal of confidence, someone seems really self-assured, the idea is that's then going to influence how others perceive the individual. And we ended up running a number of studies that found relatively consistent effects where when individuals ostensibly have high levels of self-esteem, they're perceived to be more attractive as potential mating partners. They are perceived to have more positive personality traits, so they're perceived to be more extroverted, more agreeable, those sorts of things. And they're also more likely, other people are more likely to consider voting for them. So we ran a study before the 2008 election, presidential election in the US, and we saw that people were more willing to vote for presidential candidates at that time if they thought the candidates had high self-esteem. And so what we were seeing was this fairly consistent evidence that the ostensible self-esteem level of the target also influences how other people perceive the individual. So that's it in a nutshell. It has to do with the idea that a person's self-esteem is also influencing the perceptions of those around them.
Mm-hmm. So there are many questions there that I would like to ask you about. So, I mean, in regards to the fact that, or the hypothesis that we keep track of what people think about ourselves, do we know to what extent we do that, or to what extent the sort of information that we get from other people is really that reliable? Because I mean, just thinking about the sociometer theory, I know that it has been associated with things like depression and suicide when people get negative information about themselves from other people in this case. But on the other hand, in psychology, and particularly in social psychology, there's also effects like the above average effect, where people tend to think that they are better than others in several different domains, particularly the ones that have more of an impact on their own identity, let's say, or that they are more familiar with. And I've already had on the show Dr. Robert Rivers, and we talked about self-deception, for example. So I was just wondering if, I mean, when people say something about us, or when we get implicit information, let's say, that other people might transmit us and things like that, if I mean, that is really that important in the kind of image that we have about ourselves.
Sure. So I think the key thing with the sociometer model and with the hierometer model, I think all of those sorts of self-esteem is serving this sort of tracking function, is I think what shows up in those studies is that it isn't necessarily what other people really think about the individual. It's what the person thinks other people think about them is what's important. So, for example, I may believe that that the people in my social network like me and value me, and so I may feel quite good about myself. Now, in reality, my social network may not like me at all, right? And they just kind of tolerate me and they smile pleasantly when I'm around. And then as soon as I leave the room, you know, they're just like, oh, thank goodness that guy's gone. And so I completely agree with the idea that self-deception may be an important piece of that. Now, what that means for the sociometer model, I think, is that what the sociometer model really is tracking is an individual's perceptions of what they think others think about them. Now, how accurate those perceptions are, I think that's where some of the self-deception stuff with like Trivers would come in, is are people really quite good in being honest and accurate in terms of understanding how others evaluate them? My guess is that there's a lot of variability in that. And one of the other things that to kind of tie into one of your questions is, not only are people potentially not very accurate in perceiving how others really evaluate them, there could be some motivational issues tied into that. So one is that people may not just be inaccurate kind of randomly. They may also be inaccurate in a very targeted way. So, for example, narcissistic individuals may be likely to believe that others hold them in higher esteem than they actually do, because they're strongly motivated to see themselves as being people who are respected and admired by others. So that part's certainly true. And there's also a calibration issue where sometimes people are more responsive to certain types of feedback, which also is something that the sociometer stuff has been really interesting in terms of kind of an asymmetry where people are typically much more reactive to negative events or negative perceptions than positive things.
Yeah. So you mentioned narcissism, and we will get into that in a minute. But before that, what is fragile high self-esteem?
Sure. So fragile high self-esteem has to do with feelings of self-worth that individuals may have that seem to be really vulnerable. So when people talk about high self-esteem, they're usually thinking about something called secure high self-esteem. So people who feel good about themselves, those feelings of self-worth seem to be really strongly anchored, that they are fairly robust in response to like adversity. And that's the great sort of self-esteem that people often want like their kids to have, for example. Fragile high self-esteem is going to be when people say they feel good about themselves, but it seems like if you kind of scratch at the surface a little bit, it all starts to kind of crumble. So feelings of fragile high self-esteem require a lot of external validation. So you need others to keep telling you that you're okay, that you're a good person. They also seem to require at least some degree of self-deception, where people may, kind of deceive themselves into thinking they're a little bit better than they actually are. So getting into some of the biases you were just talking to a moment ago, I think a lot of those things show up much more readily with this sort of fragile high self-esteem.
Earlier you've already touched on this a little bit, but is there any sort of relationship between self-esteem and romantic desirability?
Sure. And there is, in terms of when people are perceived to have high self-esteem, individuals tend to be much more attracted to them. There's some interesting gender differences that show up. So, for example, it seems to be the case that when males have high self-esteem, that tends to be very attractive to females. We ran a number of studies where we would have male targets and we would describe them in various ways, and it was really difficult to have a male target who had such high self-esteem that he actually started to become unattractive to female perceivers. the situation was much more complicated when we had female targets. And what was really interesting is that male perceivers seem to be kind of their maximal the sort of maximum self-esteem that they tended to be really attracted to were actually kind of moderate levels of self-esteem. Males tended to be, they found really confident women less attractive than women with moderate levels of self-esteem. We had a lot of speculation about why that might be the case, but we never had any great data to be really clear about what the underlying reason was. We thought one possibility might be that men may be somewhat intimidated by women who really seem to be quite confident in themselves, but we didn't follow up to see if there was really good support for that. But in general, the picture was much more complicated when it came to males evaluating the self-esteem levels of females.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but would you say then that high self-esteem in males is sexually selective?
I think what is selected for is going to be the some of the qualities that are connected with self-esteem. So I don't think self-esteem in itself would be selected for, but I think some of the things like the idea of confidence, desire for status, all of those sorts of things that I think when heterosexual females are looking at males and considering them as potential romantic partners, I think a lot of the things that are linked with self-esteem are the same sorts of things that women would be attracted to. Like being highly extroverted and outgoing, confident, all of those things I think are very attractive to women typically. And I think for males, it's a slightly more complicated pattern when they're evaluating female romantic partners.
Mm-hmm. And that occurs probably because high self-esteem goes associated with things like the male being able to provide the female with resources and get things done and stuff like that.
Absolutely. I think a lot of those issues that make men with high self-esteem very attractive to women, it just ends up being a more complicated picture. Males are attracted to women for a wide variety of reasons as well, and I think the really high levels of self-esteem, they tended to perceive women with high self-esteem as being less warm and less trustworthy than women with moderate levels of self-esteem, which I think gets into a lot of issues in terms of selecting long-term partners. Women, in contrast, when they were evaluating men, self-esteem as it rose, the ostensible self-esteem level of the target, they perceived the male to be even warmer, kinder, and the same thing just was not true in the way men perceived women with high self-esteem.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And in your work, I think you also talk about romantic love styles. Are there different romantic love styles or not?
Yeah, there are. Some of the most popular models were developed back in the 70s, and there were arguments that there were love styles like, for example, a game playing style called ludus. There are ideas that there was a style that was focused exclusively on passion, kind of this eros style. And there have been some really interesting ideas looking at how people kind of approach romantic relationships and the implications of those sorts of love styles on long-term satisfaction and so on. So for example, if you go into a romantic relationship and you aren't really kind of fully investing in the relationship, and it always seems like you kind of have one kind of foot out the door, where you're looking to maybe trade up partners, that creates a lot of uncertainty in the relationship, and so that sort of game playing typically doesn't do terribly much for the relationship in general.
Yeah, and since we're talking about self-esteem, what is the relationship between self-esteem and romantic love styles. I mean, is there a particular or several different romantic love styles that go associated with self-esteem?
Yeah, yeah. So individuals who really feel quite good about themselves and those feelings of self-worth tend to be relatively secure, they tend to develop love styles in their romantic relationships that really do kind of foster more intimacy and satisfaction with romantic relationship. So when they enter into these relationships, they're much more willing to form these intimate bonds with their partner. In contrast, people who have this sort of fragile high self-esteem, what tends to happen is they engage in a lot of self-protection in their romantic relationships, where they're kind of afraid to kind of put themselves out there with their partner. And as a result, they tend to do a lot of game playing, for example, where it seems as if they're constantly looking to kind of trade up from their current relationship to another potentially better romantic partner. And so what seems to go on in those sorts of relationships over time is that it just creates a lot of instability. Individuals don't feel very confident in their partner if they believe that their partner really isn't invested in and committed to the relationship. And those sorts of self-protective strategies work well for the individual in terms of protecting their self-esteem, but it prevents them from really forming deep connections with their romantic partner. And so as a result, their relationships tend to be negatively impacted over time by those sorts of things.
Does this have something to do with attachment theory? Because as you were talking about the romantic love styles, it came to my mind that we also have different attachment styles, like the avoidant one, the anxious one, the secure one. Does it have something to do with that?
Absolutely. And there's been some work showing exactly that. The same sorts of romantic love styles, there are very similar associations in terms of self-esteem and the fragility of self-esteem and attachment for exactly the reasons you were talking about. My guess is that a lot of these things are very closely entwined with each other.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's now talk about narcissism. What is narcissism to begin with?
Sure. So there's been a lot of debate in the literature about exactly what narcissism is, but I think what people agree on is it's a personality process. So I guess before I get into that, maybe to distinguish, there's narcissistic personality disorder, which is a form of psychopathology, and there are clear diagnostic criteria for that. And then there's narcissism as a personality trait, which is what a lot of my work focuses on. And so narcissism as a personality trait is really this kind of set of processes that have to do with both the way in which we interact with other people, the way in which we think about ourselves, the world around us, regulate our affect. And it's characterized by things like grandiosity, a sense of entitlement, a willingness to exploit other people, and so on. And so there are all of these features that start creating these kind of intrapsychic mechanisms and these interpersonal behaviors that really kind of constitute what we think of as narcissism.
So that narcissism as a personality trait that you're talking about is the one that people also refer to when they talk about the dark triad, right? That is narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism.
Exactly. And the connection between narcissism as a personality trait, so on this continuum, with the idea being that everybody has at least some level of narcissism. Some people may be very, very low. Other people may be really, really high, with most of us probably falling somewhere in the middle. And when people have tried to understand the connections between narcissism as a personality trait, this continuously distributed variable in the population, versus narcissism as a personality disorder, one of the areas where things are, I was going to say unclear, but I don't think it's unclear anymore, is that narcissistic personality disorder conceptualizes narcissism as being something that either you meet the criteria or you do not. It's an either-or sort of proposition. And the data suggests that that is not a great way to think about this, because it really does not appear that there is some sort of qualitative change in narcissism at some point. And so there have been attempts to start rethinking the clinical conceptualization of narcissism, and my guess is at some point in the future we'll be moving more toward a continuum model of narcissism as a personality, a form of personality pathology, rather than the current categorical system, which has not worked terribly well for us in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've already talked with different people about how we classify mental diseases or mental disorders, and I mean there's lots and lots of problems with that, and also with the DSM even. But do you think that it's possible that there are people with high narcissism that don't suffer from narcissistic personality disorder?
I think so. I think there are. So one of the things that I think has made everything very confusing in the narcissism literature, but I guess let me back before I say it's made it more confusing, is I think that in recent years there's been a recognition that there are different aspects of narcissism. And I think that's important for your question about how does narcissism as a personality trait link up with narcissism as a personality disorder. So one of the things that people have been arguing about is what's the structure of narcissistic personality, and there isn't total agreement by any stretch of the imagination, but it's getting closer than it used to be. There's a fairly broad consensus, I won't say total agreement, but a broad consensus that there are at least three important aspects of narcissism as a personality trait. One is that there's kind of this assertive, extroverted aspect of narcissism. There's an antagonistic, disagreeable aspect of narcissism, and there's a vulnerable, neurotic aspect of narcissism. The assertive, extroverted form of narcissism, in the grand scheme of life, is really not that horrible for individuals in terms of if you're looking at what things are associated with. The assertive, extroverted form of narcissism is associated with things like desire for leadership. They actually report at least having decent levels of psychological adjustment. So in terms of looking at outcomes, they don't, that particular type of narcissism doesn't seem to be all that bad for us. Now, I think there's probably a cutoff where at certain levels it becomes problematic. The other two forms of narcissism, the antagonistic, disagreeable form and the vulnerable, neurotic, are probably going to be much more toxic for individuals at relatively low levels. The antagonistic, disagreeable form of narcissism is really unpleasant to interact with folks with that type of because they're constantly, they're very self-protective, they're very sensitive, they're very reactive. The vulnerable neurotic is also a lot of distress kind of associated with feeling disrespected by others and so on.
And since we are also talking about interpersonal relationships, particularly the romantic ones, what are the kinds of relationships that narcissists establish? I mean, talking about close relationships in this case.
Sure. So as far as close relationships, what the general pattern that seems to show up again and again with narcissistic individuals is that in the beginning of a relationship, whether we're talking about a romantic relationship, a close friendship, any of those sorts of relationships, the basic pattern seems to be that they are really attractive to others at first. They're really charismatic. They just kind of draw other people in. And so in the beginning of relationships, narcissistic individuals do quite well. They're great at forming relationships. Where they really suffer is maintaining relationships over time. And so the kind of typical trajectory that you see with narcissistic individuals in terms of their romantic relationships, for example, is they're great at starting relationships during this kind of emerging zone of relationships, but over time they really start to be disliked by other people. It's difficult to work with them on a daily basis, to interact with them, because nothing is ever their fault. In terms of romantic relationships, their commitment levels tend to be relatively low. In romantic situations, they are really attentive to alternative partners. So one of the things for romantic relationships in general is that when people enter into a relationship and they're committed to that relationship, they oftentimes will start kind of tuning out other alternative partners, and they just aren't paying attention to that. Narcissistic individuals tend to still be very attentive to alternative partners, and it looks like they're always thinking about trading up, if you will, from their partner, which creates a lot of unhappiness for their partners and a lot of dissatisfaction.
Mm-hmm. So going back to self-esteem a little bit, do narcissists have high self-esteem, or does it depend on the type of narcissism, or how does it work exactly?
So it depends on the type of narcissism. So individuals who have kind of the assertive extroverted form of narcissism, they tend to have high levels of self-esteem. Now, even with that type of narcissism, one of the things that happens is the association isn't as strong as people often assume that it is. So, for example, in the literature, sometimes you'll see, at least in the past, people would sometimes use terms like narcissism and high self-esteem almost interchangeably, and that's a problem, because they are different constructs. People with the assertive extroverted form of narcissism, they have high self-esteem, but the association is modest, I would say. Most studies, it's around 0.3, maybe 0.4 in terms of correlation coefficient. So there's certainly a relationship, but nothing that's ridiculously high. The other types of narcissism, so the antagonistic disagreeable form and the vulnerable neurotic form, actually are often unassociated with self-esteem, or even negatively associated with self-esteem. And so it's really kind of a mixed picture in terms of what that connection is between narcissism and self-esteem. And the literature in the past often hasn't been terribly clear about which aspect of narcissism is really being examined. Some of the instruments that are used just kind of jumble everything together and kind of create this mixed bag of narcissism that then has kind of a muddled relationship with self-esteem.
Yeah. Okay, so going back to the topic of romantic relationships, and since we started our conversation with the self,
Sure.
how do beliefs about the self influence things like relationship satisfaction and longevity of romantic relationships?
Sure. So the way people think about themselves seems to have a huge impact on romantic relationships just in general. When it comes to things like self-esteem itself, self-esteem seems to have an impact when individuals feel good about themselves, and if those feelings of self-worth really are relatively secure. Individuals tend to develop more meaningful, deeper connections with their partners that then facilitate satisfaction and commitment. At the same time, when individuals are perceived by their partners as having high self-esteem, it has similar sorts of effects. Now, one of the things that's interesting in terms of longevity is a long time ago, I did some work when I was a graduate student, and we were interested in looking at dating couples and how they thought about their romantic partners. So we talked earlier about the idea of self-concept and how people organize information about themselves. And people also organize information about their romantic partners. So if you're in a long-term committed relationship, you probably have a conceptualization about the sort of person that your partner is. You know, your partner's honest and faithful and all these lovely things, hopefully. And so we form these sorts of representations of our partners. And those things also end up being important for predicting longevity. So for example, if someone develops kind of this, what's called a compartmentalized structure of their partner. So their partner has all of some aspects of who they are all good. and some aspects are all bad. What you start to see is if the relationship is going well, the individual tends to be very committed to the relationship because they're constantly thinking about those all good aspects of their partner. However, when people have those sorts of compartmentalized representations of their partner, when things start to struggle, so if there are things that aren't going great in the relationship, their views of their partners tend to become really negative very, very quickly. And so what we see again and again in that area of work is that when people have these really kind of simplistic compartmentalized structures, when things are going okay, they tend to do quite well, because it's basically people are always thinking about the good parts of themselves or their partners. However, when things start to go badly, then suddenly all that they can think about are the things that are wrong with either themselves or their partners. And in romantic relationships, that sort of compartmentalized structure actually predicted a higher rate of breakup a year later. People were much more likely to break up with their partners if they had this sort of relatively simplistic way of thinking about their partner.
Mm-hmm. So the extent to which people have these compartmentalized concepts of their partner, let's say, does it vary between people? I mean, does it vary in degree, for example?
Yeah, it is. It's definitely a matter of degree. So everyone tends to be somewhere on a continuum as far as how compartmentalized the way in which they think about themselves or their partners are. And getting back to one of your earlier questions about how heritable are these things, one of the pieces of information that at least ties back into that a little bit is that what we see is that when people are likely to form compartmentalized structures when thinking about themselves, they're also at least somewhat more likely to form similar sorts of structures when thinking about their partners. So it doesn't necessarily say that this is something that's genetically determined or anything of that sort, but at least it shows some consistency in the sort of cognitive structures that people tend to construct when thinking about themselves or someone else. And again, it's not a perfect relationship, but there's at least some similarity there.
Mm-hmm. So there's a thing that just came to my mind now. Is it the case that if people perceive that, for example, they are low in self-esteem and their partners are high in self-esteem and they are competent people and things like that, I mean, does that take a toll on their relationship? I mean, do people start to feel a little bit insecure and perhaps that they don't deserve the kind of partner that they have? Do we know something about that?
We don't know as much as I would like for us to know. So I think that's the important kind of take-home part. We don't know. There's a lot left to learn. Now, as far as the sort of toll that it takes, I think there absolutely is a toll. If people feel like they are in a relationship and they don't feel comfortable in the relationship because they're concerned that their partner is eventually going to recognize that they really aren't worthy of being in the relationship, I think that sort of stress and uncertainty can absolutely be detrimental to the relationship, because the person who is worried their partner is eventually going to dump them is, constantly looking for signs that maybe this is going to be when my partner is finally going to break this off. They're going to recognize that I really don't deserve to be in this relationship, and the empirical work has shown those sorts of effects to at least some degree, but I don't think the work has been perfect so far. Now, where things go well is if the individual is partnered with someone who actually makes them feel comfortable and reassures them that they really are committed to the relationship. And that's a tricky thing, because people with low self-esteem often feel like they aren't deserving, and they're constantly kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop. And in romantic relationships, waiting for that shoe to drop can in some cases actually cause the shoe to drop. If you're constantly kind of pushing your partner away because you're afraid they're going to reject you, your partner may actually feel rejected, which may then kind of start that entire process kind of unfolding. So the dynamics are very complicated, and it's very unfortunate for folks who really really do suffer from feelings of low self-esteem, because it can be very difficult to form those really tight relationships, because to put yourself out there, you have to have some confidence that your partner would want to be with you, and that can be very difficult for some people.
Mhm. I would imagine that what you just described would go associated with an anxious attachment style.
Absolutely, absolutely, and and that sort of anxiety, those sorts of not just the anxiety side, but you can also see some of the avoidant aspects popping in as well, where the individual basically is trying to protect themselves in some way, whether it's seeking that closer proximity, like through the anxious style, or trying to kind of head off the potential for them to be dumped by their partner by already kind of separating and kind of stepping back from the relationship, which may paradoxically create exactly the sort of outcome that they're trying so hard to avoid.
Mhm. Okay, another question now, and this does not have necessarily to do with romantic relationships, but what is psychological adjustment?
Sure. So there's a lot of disagreement about what psychological adjustment is. I think at the very minimum, it's going to require the absence of any form of really severe psychopathology. So I think that's kind of like a starting place. Now, once we get past that, then I think there are some really interesting questions about, in order for someone to be experiencing psychological adjustment, do they also have to have some positive indicators, not just the absence of negative indicators, but do they also need some positive things? Like, for example, do they need to feel like they have a sense of autonomy, like they have some sort of control over their lives? Do they need to feel like they have the ability to master certain types of tasks? Do they need to experience some sort of meaning in life? And I think different researchers have very different perspectives on what's really required. I think what everybody can agree to, at least some extent, is that the absence of some sort of really severe form of psychopathology would be necessary. And probably most folks agree that that alone isn't sufficient. That's kind of like a starting place. But for people to really be psychologically healthy, they probably need more than that. The ability to form meaningful romantic relationships and interpersonal connections in general, and the ability to do things like to work, the ability to have meaningful work and kind of be self-sufficient. Those things are probably important as well.
So when we talk about psychological adjustment, what are the kinds of situations that we are referring to that people have to adjust?
Sure. So there are a whole host of things. Right now we're doing this interview in the middle of a pandemic that has led to tremendous changes in most people's lives, and thinking about the sort of stress and strain that has been put on people in this sort of situation, it certainly is going to tax most individuals. I know a number of people that have reported, being much more anxious than is normal for them, being more depressed, being more stressed, and the ability of individuals to kind of endure those sorts of situations, to be resilient, is very difficult. People who start off with higher levels of psychological adjustment are often going to be more resilient, but not necessarily. There are sometimes certain situations that they may encounter that just simply overtax everything, all of their coping resources. So for example, someone who is in the middle of a pandemic, they don't have the ability to spend time with their friends and family members, so they're isolated from them. Maybe they've also lost a lot of their income because they've lost their job. Those sorts of things may be too much for most people to handle, and so it may simply overwhelm their ability to be resilient.
That's very interesting, and I was just thinking that since we are inside our houses now most of the time, I would imagine that people that are high in extroversion would be some of the ones that suffer the most from this, because it's not that easy for them to get into social situations, parties and things like that. But at the same time, I was thinking that high extroversion usually goes associated with positive emotions, but could it be that being put in this kind of situation, they could suffer from, they could start having negative emotions and suffer from anxiety, depression, and things like that?
I think it's certainly possible. I haven't seen any really great data on that yet. I know people have speculated about exactly that sort of thing. And so my guess, and that's all it is, I haven't seen any great data. My guess is that people who are really extroverted, if they are struggling to find ways to make those sorts of social connections that are so important to them, they may really be struggling with this. So I would envision them maybe having higher levels of depression, anxiety, and so on. Now, the nice thing is that technology has allowed for the possibility for people to make those sorts of connections even during a situation like this. So we can do things like a Skype interview. You can have, and I know graduate students in my program are doing a lot of things where they have like these Google Meet things where they have like social hours where a lot of them can get together digitally, even though they can't be together in person. And if people can find those sorts of creative solutions, my guess is that they can manage a little more effectively. And technology certainly helps with that. But I think you're absolutely right that some individuals are going to be in a position where the sorts of constraints that are imposed by the pandemic may just not be as detrimental to them. For example, I tend to be a little more on the introverted side of things, and I think it's probably been much easier for me to deal with being shut in my house and away from other people other than my wife. Now, it may be really hard for her to have to deal with me all the time, but at least for me, it probably is much easier for me to tolerate these sorts of social changes that have been imposed compared to someone who is very extroverted and really needs that sort of social connection. And so I think there are important differences that would absolutely have an impact on how people respond.
Well, I was just imagining that it might also have to do with some other factors, because talking about the big five, another important factor that predicts things like depression, anxiety, is how people score in terms of neuroticism. And I would imagine that since neuroticism varies independently from extroversion, you could have someone high in extroversion but also high in neuroticism.
Absolutely. And I think, not only do we have, like, for this moment in time, in the United States, for example, we have, not only are we really struggling with the current pandemic, but there are also a lot of issues going on in our society at the moment about things like social justice, racism. We're in the middle of a very highly contested presidential election. And so there are a lot of stressors that are hard for anyone to cope with at the moment. People high in neuroticism who are already predisposed to have these strong, largely negative emotional reactions are probably going to be really struggling, especially if their social connections, if they're also high in extroversion and can't have those sorts of connections, they may really be struggling.
Mm-hmm. So we talked about psychological adjustment, and it seems to me that it implies that people, at least the ones that are able to psychologically adjust, have to adapt some of their personality traits to the kinds of situations they are exposed to. But please correct me if I'm wrong, but I've been talking with some personality psychologists as well, and most of them told me that personality traits, in this case particularly the big five that are the most accepted nowadays, tend to be stable across the lifespan. Is that correct?
It is. It is. There have been some thoughts in recent years that there may be a bit more flexibility in personality traits than we thought in the past. So if we were having this conversation 15 years ago, I absolutely would have said, yep, they're pretty stable over time. They don't change a great deal. And I think that's been the kind of accepted wisdom for a long time. There have been some arguments in the last maybe 10 years or so that there's a little more variability in personality traits than we used to think. So, for example, we see that as people are moving throughout their lives, there are some really interesting kind of feedback cycles that happen where personality traits play a role in us selecting situations that we kind of opt into. So, for example, if you're someone who is highly conscientious, for example, you may select into certain occupations that really that really have a lot to do with things like leadership. A lot of responsibility are placed on your shoulders. And over time, being in those sorts of situations day in and day out may also mold, to at least some extent, your personality. So in the past, we used to think that these things are just there, they're kind of set into stone at a relatively early age and don't change a great deal. And I think there's still a lot of truth to that. I think for the most part they are relatively static, but they may be a little more malleable than we used to think. And things like the sorts of situations that we experience may shape our personalities a little bit. The sort of relationships we have with others may also do a bit of that as well.
But do you think that different people would have different degrees of being able to psychologically adjust to different situations? I mean, could it be that people with certain kinds of personality traits wouldn't be able to mold their personalities that easy?
I think that's very possible. And when we think about things like personality disorders, that's one of the issues that comes up, is this lack of flexibility. And I think there certainly is something to that. And even if we're not talking about personality disorders, I think when people are relatively extreme on certain traits, even if it doesn't reach the level of any sort of pathology, I think they may have more difficulty kind of adjusting. So someone who is slightly high in extroversion might be able to kind of adapt to things like a pandemic where social relationships are a bit interrupted. Whereas someone who is really kind of out on the fringes of extroversion and is really, really high, they may have more difficulty kind of down-regulating that and kind of adjusting. So I think there's certainly something to that.
Mm-hmm. So let's just explore one last topic. We've already talked about the relationship between narcissism and psychopathology, in the case narcissistic personality disorder. Is there any link between low or high levels of self-esteem and some sort of psychopathology or not?
Yeah, there is. So low levels of self-esteem are associated with a range of different forms of psychopathology. So depression, anxiety, eating disorders, along with some other things. Now, what has kind of evaded folks for the most part is exactly what are the causal mechanisms. It's the case that low levels of self-esteem are somehow causing these forms of psychopathology, which is often referred to as this vulnerability model. Or is it kind of the opposite way around? Is it the fact that if people are experiencing forms of psychopathology, that may actually have a detrimental impact on their self-esteem, which is referred to as a kind of psychological scar model? And for a lot of those connections, we still don't really have great evidence. However, for things like depression, there seems to be a pretty clear and consistent pattern where a guy named Ulrich Wirth has done a lot of work with taking different longitudinal data sets. And what he's found pretty consistently is that low levels of self-esteem at one point in time tend to do a pretty good job of predicting depression at a later point in time, much better than depression at time 1 predicts self-esteem at time 2. And so that suggests that low levels of self-esteem may actually be a precursor to depressive symptoms later in life. Now, if we contrast that with anxiety, the relationship seems to be pretty balanced over these longitudinal data sets where self-esteem predicting anxiety later, the association really isn't much stronger than anxiety predicting later self-esteem. They seem to be pretty balanced there. So with depression, it really does seem like in most cases, it is self-esteem that is predicting later development of depressive symptoms.
Mm-hmm. So my last question will be, we've already talked a little bit about this, but since there are several problems in the way that we nowadays classify different mental phenomena as mental disorders or not, or something that is part of the normal spectrum, let's say, of behavior and psychology, what do you think disciplines like social and personality psychology could add to the picture? I mean, do you think that by studying these kinds of things that we've been talking about from a social and personality psychological point of view, in the future we could have better ways to classify something as a mental disorder or as part of the normal psychology of people?
I certainly think there's certainly that possibility. I think some of the collaborations between social personality folks on one side and clinical psychologists and psychiatrists on the other, I think has been very helpful. My guess is that if we were to jump ahead to whatever DSM-6 looks like, my strong suspicion is that we will start moving more toward seeing a broader range of continua when we're thinking about different forms of psychopathology. For the DSM-5, when it was released, there was a lot of talk about the possibility of doing away with the current categorical system for classifying personality disorders and replacing it with a dimensional system. And at the end, they put the kind of dimensional model in the back of the DSM as a model that requires further exploration. And I think there's a tremendous amount of value in that sort of approach. Now, was it quite ready to go for DSM-5? I don't know. I know the DSM-5 work group got a lot of pushback for sticking with the categorical system. At the end of the day, I'm not sure that was a horrible decision. It doesn't work well, so I'm certainly not defending it. I also think the dimensional system, I think that's definitely the way things should be going in the future. I think it's probably still needs a bit of work to have it ironed out so that it really would be helpful for practitioners. I think for researchers, for me, the dimensional model works really, really well. I think for clinicians who are seeing people face-to-face and making decisions about treatment and talking to insurance companies about getting payment for sessions, I can see why there would be some concern about this sort of dimensional model. So I think it definitely has a great deal of value. It may just need a little more work before it's quite ready.
Mm-hmm. Well, I imagine that DSM-6 will be out this next decade, right? Because DSM-5 was published back in 2013 or 14, right?
Yeah, 2013, if I recall correctly.
Yeah.
There was a fair bit of time between it and 4R, so I'm not sure when DSM-6 will be out. It may be a while. Yeah,
let's see. Okay, Dr. Zeigler-Hill, let's end the interview here. Just before we go, would you like to mention what are the best places on the internet for people to find your work?
Sure. So my website is zieglerhill.com. That's a relatively easy place to go and see a list of publications there, and that's probably the easiest place.
Okay, so I will leave that in the description box of the interview down below so that people can go and check your work out. It's very interesting. And Dr. Zeigler-Hill, again, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show, and it was a pleasure to everyone.
It was an absolute pleasure getting to chat with you. Thank you very much for having me.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. I've started this channel back in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields, and I would really like to keep doing this in the long run, and so please visit my Patreon page and consider making a pledge there, or go to my PayPal links in the description box and you can also make a monthly pledge there, or a one-time big donation, or several times big donations. It's as you prefer. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. Finally, I would like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and supporters, the main ones: Karen Litska and Blanchett, Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anyan Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Eric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Max Bailby, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Pinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Felicia Stevens, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Staten T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deza Araújo, Eden Solan, Romain Roach, and Dmitry Grigoriev. My producers is our web, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, Luis Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Van Egdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, and my executive producers Michel Ruzieski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.